Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues, my name is Oliver Wilz. I'm head of the Middle East and North Africa department at the Berkhof Foundation. And I welcome you all to this event on accountability in times of war, where we will focus on the specific case of Yemen, but also look beyond. If you prefer or if you are in need for Arabic translation, you find details in the chat function, the chat room. But just to repeat, you can change to Arabic by the translation function. This is a small symbol of a globe. There you choose then Arabic. And if you face difficulties, please just let us know using the Q&A function to get in touch with our team. The event that we are organizing here is based on a recent publication on accountability mechanisms in Yemen. And you can find it in an English or Arabic version on our website if you are interested to download or to read it. On our work, probably just a little bit of context why we are organizing this work and why we are also focusing or interested in this topic of accountability and transparency. We have started already a while ago to work on Yemen with our Yemeni partner, the Political Development Forum, actually in 2012. And we have since then continued to work on offering opportunities for political dialogue among all the key political components in Yemen. So to think about political solutions, to create consensus on key topics in the process. But we realized also, and we started in 2018, to work also at a subnational level, at the level of governorates, because we realized that at the national level, state functions are poorly existing anymore. There's so little coordination, so many split of institutions. But at the governorate level, also partly due to necessity because people demand services, but at the governorate level, you find, in different qualities and amounts, but you find services, service provision and other state functions. So the topic of accountability in this context is important because it's a topic of supporting, strengthening state institutions at governorate level. It's also important, of course, for the international donor community who is interested in accountability mechanisms because they need and want to see whether their support to Yemen is directed towards the population. But it is, and this makes it also a political topic, it is also important for trust building and confidence among the population in the institutions. So accountability and transparency guarantees that among and within the population, between different communities, but also between different political actors, there is a sense of understanding that state institutions are really serving a common interest and not just particular regional or political contexts. So this is why at this event we think it's important to look at formal and informal accountability mechanisms and in Yemen, but also beyond. And I wish us a lively, inspiring and interesting debate. And with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Isabel, who will moderate today's session. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for framing our discussion and for again highlighting the importance of this topic in Yemen and in the region. My name is Isabel Kleitsch, and I'm a senior project manager at the Berkhof Foundation, working both on Yemen and Sudan. And I have the pleasure of guiding you through this next hour of discussion today. I just want to mention again, for those who might have joined us a bit late, that interpretation is available during this event. So if you prefer to follow us in Arabic, please click on the interpretation button in your Zoom bar, which is the little globe, and select Arabic as your language of choice. There is also an opportunity for you to pose questions to our speakers, and we will organize this again through the Zoom Q&A function. So you can pose your questions anytime throughout the event. We have a team in the background monitoring those questions and making sure that they will reach me, and I will make sure to reserve some time towards the end of this hour together to pose your questions to our speakers. So this is about it in terms of housekeeping from my side. So let me now introduce our first guest to you, Rafat Al-Akhali. Rafat Al-Akhali is a development practitioner and the co-founder of Deeproot Consulting, which is a boutique consulting firm bringing on-the-ground expertise on Yemen to international and Yemeni public and private sector clients. Welcome, Rafat. Thank you so much for joining us today. Oliver has already mentioned the publication that we have been working on, and Deeproot was actually the author of this publication, and it looked at accountability structures and their current functioning, both at a central level, but particularly at a governorate level. So can you share with our audience some of the main findings of that study, and maybe a thing that was notable for you from that exercise, looking at those structures and their current functioning?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Isabel, and a pleasure to be here and discussing this topic with everyone. I mean, as you mentioned, and as Oliver mentioned as well, accountability is, and the institutions of accountability is a very critical component of any state building project. And the first thing that came out of our study, I mean, we started looking at, first of all, just giving a glimpse of what these accountability institutions looked like in the pre-2011 time, and then looking at where they stand today. Now, of course, pre-2011, a lot of it was very centralized. Yemen has gone through a process since unification in 1990, and there were some accountability institutions as well in the two former states in the north and the south. But they have combined and then evolved from 1990 onwards. And it was very interesting to just track that evolution institutionally, the different laws that were passed, the different international conventions that were ratified, and the different institutions that were set up, such as the Central Office for Control and Audit, the Supreme National Authority for Combating Corruption, and the different structures as well created under the local authority law, which was, of course, key to our study to look at local level, how does accountability translate. And I think just one thing to reflect on from that quick review is how over about 20 years, the institutions have evolved, and they have evolved in a way that anyone who looks at it would see the transition, right? And with all of those institutions, one could there was a lot of view to see an alternative view that despite all these institutions being in place, that did not prevent, for example, state capture at the highest levels. That did not prevent the situation that we got to by 2011. And so one then questions whether these institutions were indeed, in place to provide accountability, or were they, as some theories suggest, something called isomorphic mimicry, basically countries and states creating the institutions that reflect Western views of institutions. And so, the donors want to see a national authority for combating corruption. So there we go, we have it. You want to see a parliament discussing the budget, there we go, we have it. But the actual context is very different, the political, the social context, and things still happen regardless of these institutions being in place. So that was the first kind of dilemma of looking at the past is, did we get the outcome that we need and that we're looking for from these institutions, or were they merely basically window dressing, if you want to call it that? And I think, I mean, personally, this is not necessarily evidenced, but my personal opinion is that it's definitely somewhere in between. I mean, the institutions did create these processes, did address a lot of the, let's say, what is required to have at least, the process, the law in place, and all the building components, but it didn't necessarily, reach its end goal, and it was still, especially at much higher level, not able to do that. Now, why this was important, that reflection, is to look at what's happening today and what priorities are, because once the conflict especially started, but really since the 2011 protests and what came after in the transitional period, a lot of these institutions at the central level became ineffective, one way or another. They have been fragmented after the conflict started as well. They don't have the resources needed. So a lot of things became much more localized. So we're in a period of hyper-localization, we could call it. A lot of things are being run and happen at the local level, at governorate level and district level. And there in our study, we tried to look at, what is still effective. Is it the branches of these institutions, for example? Central Office for Control and Audit is one example. Are they still doing their work? Do they still have their reporting? Is it still, even if they do, is it effective and going anywhere in the absence of a parliament, for example, and in the absence of a clear process for accountability? And what we found out, if I may just throw one finding and the rest is there, is definitely that a lot of the accountability is happening through the informal channels. It is informal accountability has become the tool or the instruments that officials respond most to. Although, as I said, the formal processes, some of it is still there, some of it's still happening. But really, when the media, activists, political parties, community groups catch on to something and, it becomes a big deal, then it gets addressed. But the formal processes haven't produced a lot of outcomes or results at this point. So these are just some initial reflections, and we can talk more about it.
Great. Thanks so much, Rafat. And you already explained why it's so important to also focus on the local level, especially given the developments since the outbreak of the war, right? Much of the governance activities is actually transferred to the local level. And we looked at 4 governorates in particular, Aden, Hadramaut, Taiz, and Al-Mahda. And in this study, I think you do find a couple of differences among those 4 governorates and some best practices also of those governorates, and where one governorate could maybe learn from the other. So you might want to share some of those insights and findings from the local level and the efforts of the local authorities in the governorates to actually tackle some of those questions and ensure some more accountability for citizens on the ground.
Absolutely, yes. That was the most interesting part, as always, with comparative studies, looking at the different governorates and seeing, what each is doing and what can be learned from one to the other. And if I may, maybe summarize the key points in three key practices, I would say, that really we should highlight. One is transparency. So any efforts and any actions to bring forward the data that citizens need in order to practice accountability in the informal channels, as I mentioned, or in general, just to have the public debate be based on actual data, information, evidence, that has been critical. So we saw that, for example, in Taiz, where there's a website for the Office of Planning and International Cooperation, and on that website there's all the reports of how much aid was spent by NGOs in the governorate. There's reports on the local authority spending. There were reports on as well the social and economic development plan for the governorate for 2 years. So that became kind of the source. And it was very interesting just recently. There was a lot of public debate in TIES. And a lot of the people who are actually, attacking, let's say, the local authority were using these reports as reference. And to me, that was a positive thing because at least, then the discourse is based on something and not just on, whims or made up things. But really, they were referring to that and saying, in that report, you said that X was spent, and yet we didn't see this here, or why, or all that sort of question. So that was a really good one. We documented a similar thing in Al Mahra, where the governorate as a whole has a website, and it's where the tender announcements are made, the news about everything the governor is doing and others is there, and so it's kind of an official channel for that. So this key first area, transparency, the more we have of that, the taking place. Inclusion, development planning, service provisioning is more inclusive and more of good examples, whether, in terms of in Hadramaut, for example, where the local councils, especially in the valley, are still active, and local councils are basically elected representatives. Last election being over 20 years now, or roughly 20 years. But still, there is a wider level of inclusion and representation than just the governor or just the executive appointed people. So that's one example. Another example in Taiz again, where an economic development council was set up that is led by the private sector and has both private sector leaders and public sector, the relevant executive offices, and as well civil society. And also many different examples of joint plans. So inclusion, another big area. And third is digital technology. They want to talk about any type of accountability and the system in place where things are digitized. There are systems in each of the relevant offices. And there was a really good example in Aden, where the Revenue Development Center was established, and it basically, they established a network connecting all the revenue offices and connecting them to the central bank, and then just being able to immediately see what revenues are coming in. Everything is automated, receipts are printed, it's in the system, so it cut a lot of the corruption, but it also made it much easier to report and to know what's happening. So three key lessons from the mapping that we did across the governorates.
Thanks, Rafat, for sharing these insights. And just so you know, you're breaking up slightly. So it seems like your internet connection isn't fully stable. Our speakers are connecting from all over the world, I would almost say. So we know internet connectivity isn't always great, but if there's anything you can do in the background to fix that, I think that would be greatly appreciated. And while I send you off to fix technological difficulties, let me bring our next speaker in. Welcome, Afrah Al-Zuba. Afrah, it's great to have you with us. Afrah is a specialist in economic development and was until recently the managing director for the Executive Bureau for the Acceleration of Aid Absorption, which to me sounds like a quite strategic placement in the Prime Minister's office in Aden, where you still are based. And you were looking into strengthening governance and strengthening the use of funds, especially donor funds, and working quite closely with the government in that position. So with that lens and based on your experience, what do you see as areas for improvement, also in terms of transparency at the central level in areas controlled by the internationally recognized government in Yemen?
Okay, thank you so much, Isabel, and it's my pleasure to be part of this discussion today. Actually, as we all know that the Yemeni central institutions faces significant challenges in transparency issue or area, and this, of course, due to the ongoing conflict and the political fragility, and also based on the historical background that Rafat already gave. So all these factors, produced this critical situation. On the central institutions, I think, there are a couple of areas that the state is trying to work on, and this is done in complete coordination and support with the international community. So first of all, we are speaking about physical transparency, where there is a need and continuous plans to develop and publish annual budgets, public budgets, and annual reports. This is being a reform requirement from Yemen partners and from general public, and at the same time, through the last years, the government tried several times to produce these budgets, annual budgets and reports. Unfortunately, it happens, I think, it happened only once. And this year, the Prime Minister announced or issued the law or the policy to develop the annual budget. So we will see in the coming months what will come from this step. On the other hand, also the importance of strengthening the institutional platforms. What as a head on it is the Anti-Corruption Commission, and also a central organization for audit and control. These institutions, especially the central, the COCA, the Central Organization for Audit, they are they are trying to practice their role on different occasions systematically. We saw them with the central bank. We saw them as a referral body from the cabinet in different occasions to do some auditing and issuing their reports. Sometimes the reports are, have their way to the main decision makers. Sometimes there is another, I would say, technical criticism on the validity of these reports. This is all, from my perspective, is understandable, as I said, because of the difficulties, the administrative and logistical difficulties these institutions still have. The third level, we are speaking also on the public relations with the central government institutions, and this Rafat gave some examples on the local government, local authorities. On the side of the central governments, there is, this kind of informal communication more than formal communication. The high-level authority, like the Prime Minister or the ministers, I think we have now like a new Prime Minister. From time to time, they are trying to meet with specific representatives from each sector, like private sector, like women organizations, like youth associations, or the representation for each sector of the community to communicate their demands and their visions communicated with the main decision makers. Still, the situation on the central level, still not, from my perspective at least, is still, suffer deep problems in these, in such area. And of course, sometimes things can be done, based, if people have better resources or better, in a better enabling environment, but sometimes it's beyond the regular discussions. It's, there are deep-rooted, including the political fragility and problems that we as countries still live in. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the deep-rooted structural problems in Yemen, I think anyone working in the country and engaging with Yemeni society and political actors is well aware of the challenges. But I think you've also highlighted a couple of attempts of really improving engagement with citizens, improving transparency also at the central level. And you've mentioned the international community and the donors. And I think in your former position, you were closely in touch with the international community. And I just wanted to hear from you some ideas on how they could constructively also contribute to an improvement of the situation. What role can they play in their interactions with the government? What leverage do they have, and what can they do?
Yeah. So, the support that is being provided to Yemen since, day one was almost, directed to, especially the institutional support, directed toward enhancing or improving the transparency and accountability. So almost there were and still many projects that dedicated to build the capacity of central institutions, including central bank and Ministry of Finance and the other relevant bodies like customs and taxation authorities. So this is one role that's, and still the efforts still until now ongoing. And we faced a good, or we found a good results out of this, like, the improvements, the clear and obvious improvements in the performance of the central bank and the trust that the central bank and it's developed among international partners. The second thing is the conditional aid reform. Aid that is conditioned by reforms agenda, and clearly this is happened with the Saudi support since early stages. Saudi support usually combined with reforms agenda, either in mainly in financial and financial side, and also in service provision like electricity sector, like we remember Saudi fuel subsidy in 2021 to 2022. It was laid on basis for a reform in the electricity sector, enhancing the efficiency of Ministry of Electricity, for reforms in tariffs collection, and building sustainable models, enhancing the role of the private sector. So this has happened. Also the budgetary support that Saudis provided to Yemen, where it has been linked to reform agenda that's supervised by Arabic Monetary Fund. 2000, 2020, 2022, 2023, 24. And this is also this reform agenda also has been pushed to a good, levels. The third layer of this support is the political and financial support to the government. As you know, Yemen now is unfortunately faces also economic difficulties, and revenues is being also deteriorated due to the stop of oil exportation. So that, when we speak about reforms, sometimes it's, that if the position of the government, it can't provide services to the citizens and, to manage the economic situation in the country. Usually the position of the government is not strong enough to push or endorse reforms. So political and financial support, this is needed, and we also see it in many occasions. Finally, we are speaking about supporting the watchdogs groups, including civil society, including, the state structures responsible for supporting or, enhancing the transparency and accountability environment in Yemen.
So some very concrete steps how the international community can actually also make a difference in terms of accountability mechanisms. Thank you so much, Afra, for sharing those. And let me now bring in our last speaker to this panel, Nader Kavani. Nader, welcome. Nader is a senior fellow and director of the Governance and Development Program at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Nader, I know that you have read our publication with great interest, and I'm very curious to hear your views about it. So what resonated with you when reading the study, and were there maybe also points where you disagreed?
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you so much, Isabel. Thanks very much to the Berga Foundation for inviting me to be part of this excellent discussion. The report itself, honestly, was really excellent. I've been following Deeproot's work for a few years now, and they never cease to amaze in terms of the quality of the work, the detail, and the clarity. And hats off to Rafat and the team for producing such a valuable comprehensive report. What I really liked was, in fact, the detail, the local level analysis. So not just the high level, but actually getting into the details of what actually works at the local level. The clarity of the analysis, and the structure in terms of pulling out key recommendations, and key recommendations for the various groups, from international organizations to the national government to localized things. So there's not much to criticize about the report. And I think it's valuable reading for everybody. For those who haven't had a chance to, I strongly advise that. That's a good use of time. Rafat's comments also, that weren't in the report as much, but you can get a sense of, the nuance is things like the Western view of the institutions, and how they developed. I think that's something that definitely can be expanded on. But this is what these conversations are for. In terms of reflections, I think I'd like to just focus on three points that I think both highlight some of the strengths and some additional areas where you can dig in the report. The first one was that there's a lot of information about institutions that operate in Yemen and how they link and operate at a local level. But we have to keep in mind that in times of crisis, there are severe resource constraints and there are severe capacity constraints. And to some extent, it does mean that there is benefit from focusing on not all the institutions. What oftentimes countries in conflict do is they try to keep running the way they have, rather than focusing on a few key institutions that can make a difference when they don't have full capacity and full resources. And you get a sense that this is the case in Yemen, where all the institutions are running, but some institutions are more important than others. And Rafat and Afrah both mentioned the Central Organization for Control and Auditing. This was established initially in the Yemen Arab Republic in 1974, and then in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in 1982. And it's a core institution. And so, when you start thinking of limited resources and capacities, this is one of those places you want to possibly, invest in to make sure it operates effectively. On the High Authority for Tender Control, the report does mention some ideas about the importance of maybe doing tenders at the local level, the government level, as opposed to the national level. So what services or what functions does it serve? Does it need to keep all those functions? Can it devolve some of those functions? Those are important questions to ask. And institutions like the National Authority for Combating Corruption, established in 2006, it's great to have those institutions, but it could be a nice to have during times of conflict. And so, again, trying to keep everything going at the same time, maybe not the most optimal use of resources. That's one thing that I think the report doesn't want to get into those details, but I think it's important possibly to identify where the priorities should lie. The second point is, and it builds on something Rafat said, but transparency is key. We had a program or project that looked at governance across the Middle East, and we had long discussions about this last year in the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. And I pushed him in part of a discussion last year to say, okay, what key lever is the most important? And I think there was a consensus about transparency. And I think that comes very clearly in the report, and it comes very clearly also in Rafat's comments. That provides valuable information for audit, for oversight, for trust building, and it's something that can be done. So international organizations, donor communities that are giving funding can require that. They can require a modicum of transparency, and it's easy to tell whether that's being carried out. I mean, is the data available? Is the information made public? Are the websites functional? So this is an ask that can be followed up with actual by the donor community to see that it takes place. And yes, it does, as Rafa pointed out, create some problems and headaches for local authorities, because then people come back and use it. But it's part of that trust building mechanism that you need to really take place over the long run. The final point I want to make is, and it relates to this, another point that was mentioned, is the issue of oversight. And again, that goes back to the first point. You need some oversight, some mechanisms. It could be at the informal level, at the local level, but you need to kind of really build on what those are and try to institutionalize them. And the questions I was asking myself is, okay, what was in place before 1990? What were in place before these things? So there's a lot of informal mechanisms that I've pointed out, mentioned media, social media, other mechanisms. Oftentimes there are tribal mechanisms, there are some community mechanisms. Sometimes these have been replaced over time by formal mechanisms. But in times of conflict, they come back or can be brought back because they operated in the past, and you have the seeds of something like that. So that's those, especially in the context of Yemen, I think those digging a little bit into those is going to be key. And to what extent you want to keep one or two levers at the national level in place, an ombudsperson, somebody able to follow up on these things. So those are kind of the main reflections that I had in terms of feedback, not to take away from anything in terms of the report and how excellent it was, just mostly food for thought and food for conversation.
Yeah, very much appreciated. And this is why we're gathering here, I guess, to enrich the report and its findings with some further perspectives. And I think those are very much appreciated, Nader. And when we spoke in preparation for this conversation, you said something that stuck with me, and I want to pose this as a question to you so our audience can also benefit from it. You said we can put all these nice structures in place and they will be there, but what do we do if something goes wrong? And something will go wrong. So, Nader, what do we do when something goes wrong?
Oh my God. So these are the kinds of questions I pose to others, not to have it come back to me.
Now I put you on the spot. See?
Um, no, what do you, I mean, really, what do you do when things go wrong? And I think I think it comes to the third point. When I mentioned oversight and I mentioned having some authority, either an ombudsperson or some authority in place that can handle these things. And it's so important. And I think it's really overlooked because we forget about these things. We put together institutions, but what happens if there's a problem in terms of corruption? What happens if there's a very, very clear case of a tender going awry? And who do you bring this to his attention? And it could be an individual, it could be an organization. Is there some entity there that can really follow up? And I mean, among all the things that I would highly recommend doing is investing some authority in an institution that plays that role. The trick for them is not to be they're going to get all kinds of requests even in normal times. Forget about times of conflict. They'll be inundated with and the trick then is to filter. You know, how do you identify, how do you get the ones that really count? But having that is going to be key. And again, it's an institutional thing. I'm a big fan of having a strong ombudsperson that goes to the highest authority that can step in when there really needs to be, and some flexibility in their decision making to identify what to focus on. But I think that. Thank you for the question.
And thank you for answering it. I think it's very valuable to also think about those things, right? The day after all these institutions might someday work, right? There is always a step more to take.
Yeah.
Great. So I want to bring in our two other speakers and open it up a little more. We've heard quite a bit about informal mechanisms already. I mean, there's institutions and institutional mechanisms that are set in place, but then there are all these informal mechanisms, social controls. We've heard about activists, social media, journalists, and they have begun to play quite a big role since the outbreak of the conflict. And Afrah, you also followed that space quite a bit, and you were highlighting a couple of examples where those activists and social media influencers did play quite a significant role in holding the government accountable. Do you want to share some of those examples with our audience?
Yeah, as we, before starting to speak about the role of the social media influencers and activists, I want also to highlight that one of the important factors, in transparency issues is the communication channels between the government and the general public. In Yemen, the current situation, this channel is blocked. So there is no communication. So this is yes, it gave a space for the activists, for the social media influencers to play a vital role in communicating people's demands, in amplifying the citizens, anger due to the weaknesses of public services, the economic situation, and they are conveying, or they are, representing this very important part, and they can, in many cases, mobilizing corrective actions from the government side. And I can remember or here put an example like Women Revolution. I know the influencer, the lady who invited or who was behind this Women Revolution. She's influencer. She doesn't have anything to do with political agenda or something like that, but because she was very sincere, her voice was very loud and trusted. So was like surprising that she can, invited and encourage hundreds of women to demonstrate and raise their voice to improve the basic services. And based on this movement, we saw that time the Prime Minister, he was saying, like, we hear your voices. We know that you have right to do so. This was very important. So this one was one example. The other side of this movement is that, and it's risky, and it harmed the idea of the transparency. And one of the reasons, or the main reason for this, as I said, the blockage for the communication channel is the misleading campaigns, misleading information. Unfortunately, due to also the lack of laws that can control the social media and the type of information shared on the social media in Yemen, we faced another sort of people who weaponize the social media and use it for misleading and for political campaigns, for gains, sometimes. And, all of us, me, Rafat, and everybody is, we know what does this mean. It makes people lose the faith on everybody on the public sphere, for everybody who's trying to support or to do something, either in the government as officials or on the civil society side. So we have those two angles of the role of the social media and influencers. Their role is very important. But I think in parallel to their role, I think the regulations and policies regarding utilizing their role or improving their role should be done to avoid making people lose the faith in everybody around.
No, definitely. Misinformation is a huge problem, not only in Yemen, but particularly, of course, also in such a context. So there is this danger, but as you were saying, there is also a personal danger to those people who go out on the street, who get public with their demands. And this is obviously a very individualized act of calling out people. And then, Rafat, you have also looked at different community activities and the role of local authorities and how those engage in more informal mechanisms. So I'm thinking about dialogue mechanisms at the local level, trainings to local authorities, like those kinds of also informal mechanisms, I would say, but also very powerful mechanisms. So maybe you can talk a bit about the role of those mechanisms and some good practices there that you have seen working.
Absolutely. I think that's when the best results happen, when there's actually this collaborative spirit between whether it's, again, civil society, private sector, political parties, community groups, and local authorities. And we've seen many examples of that. And it's, a bit of a tricky part where, the more formalized structures, for example, civil society organizations, when it is formalized in that way, if you are a civil society organization working in Aden, for example, or Hadramaut, or any governorate, you are reliant on the local authority to grant you the permit for your work. So that draws a certain type of relationship between the two sides and limits what a lot of formalized civil society organizations can do. Because, easily the first thing is they delay your permit and you cannot implement any of your programs anymore. And that's why we've seen a lot more from either, individuals or journalists or political parties even. There's really good examples of that, or political groups, even if they're not parties, who kind of have a more equal relationship with the entities that they're trying to hold accountable. But even there, if what we've seen is when it becomes more combative, then really nothing happens. And we might see some of those examples today in Yemen, like for example, in Hadramaut, where a lot of things come to a standstill because the two sides cannot reach agreement anymore. But when it's more collaborative, we see a lot of good examples in that area. And also, we can take the example in Hadramaut, where an economic development plan will be actually launched on Tuesday, which was developed jointly, by the local authority and private sector and others. So I think we need to move more towards that type of relationship than the other type. But keeping all that in mind, and this is maybe to an answer in one of the questions put in the Q&A, these informal channels are still what officials would, let's say, put more weight on in the absence of the formal processes and procedures and structures. Because again, even when the formal structures were somewhat in place, let's say up until 2011, there was always a way to work around them. They were very politicized. And, for example, COCA reports, if you look at any COCA report for any ministry, for example, you'd be scared from all the violations that are listed there and huge violations. But then the answer was always that the ministry, has someone allocated to this task. When COCA submits their report, that person writes an equally thick report refuting everything that was in COCA's report. And then that's where things end. And then at some point, some member of parliament will want to make a point of that. So he will refer to the COCA report, call the minister in, minister will go, and then eventually probably, get that member of parliament a gift or put him on one of the, institutions that are relevant to the ministry, or give him a flight to go join some meeting relevant to the ministry, and things stop. So there was always a way to deal with those, and unless some political power wants it to happen. But nowadays, when it's out in the street, when everyone is against you, like every party, every official is trying to, although there's no elections, but that's the only thing they have is people's opinions of them and the pulse in the street.
Yeah, and that pressure on the street, which then does make a difference. Okay, thank you for those insights. Nader, we also brought you in because you have a bit more of a comparative perspective as well, and Oliver mentioned that in the introduction, that this session focuses on Yemen, but we also want to look a bit broader at the region. And of course, accountability is not only a topic that is relevant to Yemen, but plays a big role throughout the region. So maybe there's a couple of lessons from your work that Yemenis can actually learn from other countries. Are there things that you have seen work in other countries, other contexts in the region that you feel like are relevant for the Yemeni context, and where we could also take some experiences into account and on board? You're on mute. We can't hear you yet.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so the wider region, the Middle East region, I mean, most countries have a lot of common. And you can see this, for example, there's a democracy deficit across the region. And bar none, all countries have democracy issues. There's an issue of, let's say, women's empowerment across the region. Bar none, all countries have issues that need to be addressed in terms of that. Governance, not so much. I mean, there are many things in common, but corruption or governance or accountability is one of those things where actually there's not something that is kind of anchoring the region down and the global indicators. And so there's just the first thing is that there's a lot that can be done. I think one example I got to see firsthand was when I visited Damascus in January this year, and I visited again a couple of times in Syria. And before December 8th, corruption was endemic. When you have salaries of workers at public sector workers at $25 a month, means that you have less than $1 a day to put food on the table, and that's not enough. Then you have corruption at an institutional level. I mean, people there's no other way but to give a bribe or to do anything. But and it went from the lowest, the smallest employee to the highest levels. Like that, things switched. You go in January, and suddenly no one was taking a bribe that I could see. Things still have to work out in terms of the overall of the country right now, and there's definitely issues in terms of how things are developing. But you see it in terms of the tendering system, you see it in terms of public sector employment, you see it in terms of lots of issues where all of a sudden accountability mechanisms are in place and things have changed. Now the country, there's still all kinds of things happening. So when I describe Syria, I'd say very little has changed and everything's changed. When I say everything has changed, I mean these underlying systems. So that means you need political will, some sort of political change, and then a lot is possible. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It's definitely possible. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that to be wary of the big things. You have small corruption, small accountability stuff, but the things that really trip the country up are the big levels. So let's take Lebanon as an example. I mean, Lebanon, what tripped it up isn't necessarily petty corruption at the employee level. What tripped it up was massive corruption at a national level. That created the kind of debt crisis that then tumbled the whole country into a financial decline that hasn't emerged from. So it's important to distinguish between the smaller things and the big picture. You can get the smaller stuff more or less right, but still miss a couple of the big ones. And so the thing to think about in Yemen is to avoid those big crises that could get you into major trouble down the line. The final point is one from Somalia. So I was in Somalia and I saw firsthand how there was pressure. A lot of these institutional issues are handled at the tribal level, informal mechanisms. And there was a big push from the donor community to stop those and move them towards more official mechanisms. And from what I saw, most of the times, the formal institutions were not ready for it, and problems emerged down the line. So the message I would have is don't discount the informal ones. Don't discount the community-based mechanisms, the accountability mechanisms. They're really important, especially when the formal institutions are still weak and struggling. Those are three observations for you.
Yeah, and one question from our audience actually ties nicely into your last point about the informal institutions. Afrah, I want to turn to you again on the women and the women's voices. And this is really, again, a question on informal mechanisms. So one of our guests actually asked, do you think that the internal voice of communities, especially women's voices, has more impact than reports and visits by the international community? And how can these voices be strengthened and become an essential part of accountability? Maybe you can share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, yes. I think maybe because they are reflecting the actual needs in the society, they are facing it directly through the education of their kids, the health system, the day-to-day living needs. So certainly, I felt like they are resonating. And the other side, currently we have like 4 or 5 ambassadors women. So this is also helps also, to make these linkages when those ambassadors visited Aden or visit Aden, they have better space, to meet with women and hear their voices. So this is also helps, and I think also, women, Yemeni women, they have a good history of organizing themselves in different historical moments. And for example, we have annual women event gathering. It's on national level, held here in Aden for maybe this happens this year will be the 5th time to do. and they reflect not just on women issues, but on the overall economic and social and even political situation. So I think women are doing well in trying to, to make their voices heard. And international community, they can't only support women per se, but at least I think they are, from our, discussions with the ambassadors, they are trying to convey the messages and the needs and demands women are reflecting to the, either to the other international partners or also to the counterparts on the Yemeni government side.
Great. Thanks a lot. We've been sort of answering questions from the chat throughout, and we've unfortunately reached the end of our time together. So I hope our audience got some answers to their questions throughout this conversation now. A big thank you to our speakers for joining us today. Thanks also to our interpreters for making this event accessible to Arabic native speakers. I know that we've had quite a few of them in the audience, and I also want to thank my colleagues in the background for the technical support in making this event happen. And of course, last but not least, a great thank you to our audience for joining us today. We hope to see you next time in one of our further events. Thank you.